Welcome back to the Smells Like Human Spirit podcast, everyone. I am your host, Guy Evans, and I am joined today by a very special guest, Cale Sampson. He's a Canadian hip-hop artist known for his socially conscious and thought-provoking lyrics that challenge mainstream beliefs in the aim to enable listeners to think critically about society. He is known as the innovator of a style of hip-hop called info-rap, and his debut solo album, entitled Cale Sampson, was released in 2009 to critical acclaim. Cale, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, Guy. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
To kick things off here, Cale, I guess the best place to start is just by talking a little bit about your background. Could you tell us, how did you get involved in this genre of music to begin with?
I first got introduced to hip-hop when I was about 9 years old. At the time, I was living in the west end of Toronto with my mom, and I remember that I was living in an apartment building on the 12th floor, and whenever I would have to go through the lobby to get into the elevator, I'd have to walk by this group of older cats, and they would always be freestyling and ciphering, and one day they just kind of took a liking to me, and they started giving me a bunch of tapes to listen to, and fortunately for me, the tapes that they gave me were of the original great MCs, and a lot of the original political and socially conscious MCs like KRS-One and Chuck D and Professor Griff from Public Enemy. And I would go upstairs and listen to these tapes at a really young age, and it became very clear that these guys weren't talking about mindless subject matter. They were talking about real life social injustices that were occurring, which I guess the mainstream media wasn't reporting on, and they were providing their listeners with real street-level commentary that were based on their experiences through the music. So that was the original sort of hip-hop spirit and soul that first touched me and spoke to me and that inspired me to become a hip-hop artist myself.
And you can certainly see those influences in your music. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you're a native of Canada. And am I right in saying you're specifically from Toronto? Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, I was born and raised in Toronto, still live here.
So for those of us who haven't had the opportunity to visit Toronto or grow up there, could you just tell us a little bit about life growing up in Toronto? What was that like?
Well, life was very interesting for me. I moved around a lot with my mom. We lived in probably about over 10 different places, 10 different areas or sub-areas of Toronto. I had a chance to meet and discover a lot of different communities of people, which is sort of representative of Toronto as a whole. It's one of the most diverse cities in the world, I believe, and there's a budding life, a budding heartbeat in Toronto. It's thriving. It's not always the best in the winter, to be honest with you. It's pretty damn cold. Like it is, it's been a terrible winter. But in the summertime, it's a thriving city. There's all sorts of cultural events, and I think it's one of the best cities that I've been to. I mean, I'm really happy to have grown up here. I've had a lot of just character building throughout the years in Toronto. It's a good city. What can I say?
Very good. Well, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people listening to this interview who were made aware of you first, Cale, by your appearance on RT News with Abby Martin a few months ago. Would you mind telling us a little bit about how that all came about?
Yeah, I mean, I reached out to Abby after I had the opportunity to go down to Occupy Toronto and speak to the people. And fortunately, I did a spoken word piece there that kind of went semi-viral, and I sent that to Abby Martin, and obviously, she is a huge advocate of the Occupy movement, and I explained to her that I was working on finishing up my album, The Big Picture, and she invited me down to Washington with my wife to appear on her show, Breaking the Set. It was an amazing experience going down there, being in the belly of the beast, and having a chance to film both Breaking the Set, and then I also appeared in a documentary called Exceptionalism with Abby, and Chris Hedges is in that as well. And so for people who don't know Abby Martin, she's definitely one of the most courageous journalists of our time, in my opinion. Really genuine, great person, and really putting her neck out on the line, exposing the truth and challenging the corporatocracy through her daily political talk show, Breaking the Set, on RT, as you mentioned.
You mentioned the Occupy movement there. So generally speaking, what are your thoughts on the Occupy movement, what it was able to achieve, kind of the status of the whole movement at the present time? This is something we've talked about on the podcast before. On a mainstream level, there's kind of the opinion that the movement is dead at this point, but I think if you speak to people still very much involved in it, they would have something to say about that. But generally speaking, as I say, what are your thoughts on that whole movement?
Well, I think that the Occupy movement did an incredible job of exposing the tremendous amount of economic disparity that's rampant, not only in North America, but all across the world. And I think that even though the mainstream media attempted to portray the occupiers as being these sort of lazy, unemployed, drum-playing teenagers who lacked a cohesive message, I think that their message did get across. And I can speak, as I said, from personal experience, because I did have the opportunity to go down there and talk to a lot of people. My wife went down there on multiple occasions, and we met people from all walks of life. We met stockbrokers and traders who had been fired from corporations, and we also met elderly people who had lost their mortgages, their homes and their life savings thanks to the crash in 2008. And I think people just need to remember that the Occupy movement was happening in hundreds, if not thousands of cities, trying to draw attention to global issues that affect us all indirectly or directly. So I definitely support the movement. I'm glad to have been a part of it in my own way. And even though the police forces eventually did squash it, I think that the sentiment and the spirit that initially sparked the Occupy movement to begin with is still very much alive and only continuing to thrive, especially amongst the younger generation.
Very well said, if you don't mind me saying. That was very well put. Well, again, as I said in the introduction, you're known as kind of the creator of this style of hip-hop, info rap. How does that differentiate from other styles of hip-hop?
Well, info rap is sort of a moniker I use to describe my style of hip-hop, because the majority of my songs are essentially information-oriented. I would call them essays, because they are basically information that just so happens to rhyme. I base a lot of my research on multiple sources, both in the mainstream and alternative media, and I present it through hip-hop. So you have info rap, and I guess what makes it a little bit distinctive from other styles of hip-hop is that the song structure is not really typical. There's a sort of a disregard towards the traditional song format. For example, I have a song at the end of my album called The Money Song, which is a piece that tries to clearly explain how money is created. So sometimes when you're dealing with this sort of macro complex information, it's hard to condense it and package it into a little 2.5 to 3 minute jingle. So the information and the message always takes priority and comes first.
Sure. Have you ever felt pressure to kind of conform to the more sort of, I don't want to say acceptable forms of hip-hop, but the type of hip-hop that we tend to see in the mainstream? Obviously, you're kind of going against the grain with the way that you approach things, sort of being socially conscious and trying to have a positive message. It's kind of a far more lucrative path, I think, to, kind of dumb down the lyrics a little bit and talk about materialism and, like I say, some of the things we associate not only with popular hip-hop, but popular music in general. Have you ever felt the pressure to kind of, cross over to the other side and do that?
I mean, maybe there was brief periods when I was young where, a lot of people sort of around me had a different perspective on what being a hip-hop artist was. But like I said, I was very fortunate at a young age to be exposed to the style of hip-hop that I represent, that talks about the empowering aspects of it, the positivity, the communal aspects. So that's always been the type of hip-hop that I've tried to create myself. So not really, to be honest with you. I've always just chosen to be a counterculture artist and try to build up momentum. It's never really been about popularity or wealth or girls or anything. To me, it's always just been about building my own home in the underground by making meaningful, message-oriented music and doing my best to kind of amass a community of real supporters from the ground up and just challenge the machine by beating them at their own game independently. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's the best way to do it, because not only do you get to keep pretty much 100% of the profits that you do earn when it's just you running the show, but you get to maintain your creative control over your work and, more importantly, keep your artistic integrity, which is really what it's all about.
Well, if we look at the current state of the genre, many commentators and observers have pointed out that there seems to have been a consistent shift away from lyrical content during the last 15 or 20 years or so. Would you agree with that assessment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you look at the history of hip-hop and other genres, you see these sort of grassroots organic movements that started out as being very anti-establishment, and then as they grow in popularity, they always end up getting hijacked by corporate America and transformed and commoditized into something that pretty much ends up being the polar opposite of what it originally intended to be. So in the case of hip-hop, you had this street-level style of music that bursted onto the world stage, which was, about social commentary and empowering people and about lyricism, and it's basically being pretty much completely co-opted by the mainstream establishment and turned into a very watered-down, condensed version of what it used to be, which is pretty much now completely in alignment with the corporate America value set, promoting consumerism and, empty materialistic values. So even though the original spirit of hip-hop music is still alive these days, it's definitely way out of balance. And you're not going to hear that type of pure hip-hop music on the radio because it's buried in the underground, and the average person has to dig really deep in order to find it now.
And we should mention a lot of these criticisms, I think, were present in the mid-90s when, the so-called gangster rap genre was kind of the predominant form of hip-hop. But I think the thing that's really noticeable now is just the lack of variety on, artists' albums, because you always had the party songs, the club songs, but then there were always the tracks that were intensely lyrical, that had a message, that had some positivity to them. And that just seems completely missing. And I think you alluded to it there, saying the balance is completely out of whack. Do you think that, it's okay to have the less serious songs as long as it's all in balance at the end of the day?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, hip hop is what it is, it can be anything as long as you're being genuine and truthful to it. We all have different sides and branches to our personality, but at the end of the day, it's all about just being real and being authentic with your listeners, because the majority of music, whether it's hip hop or any type of music that's pumped out to the masses, is insincere, and people are going to. The majority of music that's pumped out, like through the radio, is insincere. That's what I mean. But people are going to know if you're not being real with them. So it's important to, be fun, be serious, be political if you have to, be whoever you are, but just be real with your audience.
Do you think in general artists, not only hip-hop artists, but artists in general, have an obligation to disseminate positive messages within their art? Do they, especially if they have a wide audience, do they have a responsibility to, as much as possible, say some things that are really going to make a difference and resonate with people?
Without a doubt. I mean, if you are a popular artist who's being played on the radio and who's on television and who is in the public eye with people looking at you, you absolutely have a responsibility to promote a positive message, in my opinion. And there's no denying that music has a huge ability to influence people's behavior and to shape trends and culture as a whole. So when you have these mainstream acts, when you have these sort of carbon copy gangster rappers, or even some of the pop acts, Miley Cyrus or Kesha, I'm not going to name names, it doesn't really matter, but putting forth sort of a materialistic shallow message, I think that it's a very dangerous thing to society because, truth be told, you have millions of impressionable young people looking up to these acts, because that's what they are, and more or less being conditioned to think that they're the definition of cool. And so you have millions of young people trying to mimic and emulate those negative behaviors. And, even with that being said, I do think that with great art comes the possibility for great change. And I think that music doesn't always have to be entertaining. It also has the ability to educate and to inspire people as well. And we all have creativity inside of us. And, at the end of the day, I'm just a regular guy who's trying to do my best using hip-hop music, which happens to be my medium, to try to provoke thought and raise awareness and try to encourage other people to use their creative medium so that collectively we can try to get some positive, as you said, social change happening.
Well, I think you certainly have raised awareness in your own way. And, of course, as time has gone on, it seems like, Cale, you've really started to develop, a bigger audience, and rightfully so, I think. I'm interested to know, what do you rank as your most significant achievements since you began performing as a hip-hop artist?
That's a tough one. I don't know. It's sort of it all sort of melds together. It's the whole experience. Obviously going down to Washington and meeting Abby was a great experience. I've had a lot of ability to travel around. I've been around Canada. I've toured through North America, through the States at times. Even been as far as Taiwan, even with my group back in the day. But I don't know, man. It's just about sort of making a difference in people's lives. Truthfully, when you have people reaching out to you from places as far as Africa or Japan or Australia, and when you have people from all real people writing you personal messages. Like I've had a woman who had terminally ill cancer write me to ask me to write songs about the medical industry and big pharma. I've had people from Greece write me to try to talk about the imposed economic austerity that's going on over there. And I've even had soldiers in war contact me, literally, just congratulating me and saying, thank you for exposing the lies and hypocrisies and false flags associated with war through your work. So you kind of feel a bit of a moral responsibility to be a bit of a voice for the voiceless. And that's really what it's about to me. I would say the greatest achievements is knowing that I'm touching people in their hearts and making a difference and making real music for real people that connects in a very real way.
You alluded to there quite a few important things: big pharma, the global economic system, the military industrial complex, among other things. What do you feel are the most pressing issues people really need to take notice of currently at the start of 2014? What things do you think people should really be putting some time aside to get themselves informed and educated about?
Okay, well, two things that come to the forefront of my mind. Number one would be Fukushima in Japan, where we have thousands of tons of radioactive water being dispersed into the Pacific Ocean, destroying aquatic ecosystems and contaminating our food supply. And the fact that that's not on the front cover of every mainstream newspaper all around the world every day for practically the last 3 days is baffling to me. Secondly, I would say that gaining an understanding of the global food supply, gaining an understanding of the monopolization of that region that's going on through companies like Monsanto. I think it's really important for people to understand that Monsanto is not a food company. It's actually a chemical company that's being responsible for such remarkable things and contributions to humanity as Agent Orange and DDT, which has been used to kill thousands of people in warfare historically. And now we have this same chemical company genetically modifying all of our foods, genetically modifying things like corn and soy and sugar beets and rice, which are added to almost everything that we eat. And despite the fact that Monsanto's completely manipulating nature and having a complete disregard for our public safety, somehow they are legally allowed to do this thanks to the lobbying and revolving door relationships that they have with both the U.S. government and other governments across the world. I'd say that those two things come to the forefront of my mind when it comes to most pressing issues that we're faced with in 2014.
If you had to pinpoint one reason why these things aren't more publicized and why people aren't talking about them on the type of scale that you described, what would that reason be? Is it because it's a concerted effort by the media to kind of focus on, things that don't really matter? Is it that people are just, quite frankly, too busy and don't have the time and energy to devote to these type of subjects?
Well, I definitely the media plays a huge factor. The majority of people get their information from the television. So if the television is not reporting on these issues, then they don't really exist in the public consciousness. So I would say that that's a huge aspect. And again, with that being said, I'm really just happy to be alive right now and to be sort of aware of this revolution that's happening with alternative media and this sort of renaissance of citizen journalism where we've got people of all walks of life taking it upon themselves to be the media, doing podcasts like how you're doing, Guy, making YouTube videos, whatever they have to do to help spread the word and get out there. That's all I'm doing. I view myself more or less like a journalist who's just, instead of writing, converting information into rhyme form. So, yeah, the general public is not supposed to know about all this stuff. We know that. So yeah, I'd say the mainstream media and the corporate media controls a lot of the information, as we know, and it's really up to us to sway the tide and move it in another direction.
So you've talked about some very important issues today, but one of the more farcical stories that we've all been tracking with bated breath is the ongoing Rob Ford saga, which at one point a couple of months ago was just at fever pitch. It was almost a new story every hour about the latest, stupid thing this guy had said or done. From the perspective of someone who's actually from Toronto and lives in Toronto, could you give us your thoughts on Rob Ford the man and also the controversy that has surrounded him in recent times?
Well, there's a funny video that just came out last night, actually, that I saw, where he was in a fast food restaurant, completely drunk and speaking in broken patois. I don't know whether you've seen that one yet.
I have not, but I will get on it immediately following this interview.
Yeah, even I had to think that was kind of funny. But, all joking aside, Rob Ford is a guy who's obviously addicted to a few things. And as your listeners probably know, as we all know, was caught smoking crack on video, lied to the public by denying that video existed. And once the video came out, he said that he, must have been in one of his drunken stupors. But the thing to me that is the most amazing about it all is that even after all of that, his approval ratings actually went up. And I think that that's the real issue. When it becomes acceptable and even popular for a politician to get away with such blatantly irresponsible behavior while he's supposed to be in charge of organizing millions of people's lives and handling $1 billion budget worth of taxpayer money, I think that it sets a very dangerous precedent for other political leaders to follow in his footsteps. And it's only going to continue to get worse. So, really just by approving Rob Ford's behavior, I would say the people of Toronto and the people of Canada as a whole, and one could even argue all around the world, people of the U.S., because it became an international story. Ironically, as my wife pointed out to me, at a very sort of convenient time for Obama, while he was going through the Obamacare crisis, suddenly comes this guy who makes him look like a hero because he's just, such a buffoon. But, by approving of all this sort of behavior, it, to me, even though it may be funny now, in the long run, the joke's going to really be on us, the people, if we don't put our foot down and kind of say that's enough.
Especially if the man gets reelected.
Right. And as I said, his approval ratings went up. So, you just never know.
Well, there's been a lot written about the damaging effect that this whole, well, it's not really just one crisis with Rob Ford, it's a series of crises, the damaging effect that it's had on the reputation of Toronto and Canada in general. Is that overblown in your view, or do you think there's really something to that?
I can't really tell, but, because I've only been in Toronto since this has happened, so I don't really have an accurate worldview to comment on something like that. But, obviously, I would say that it probably has. We will see this summer. We'll see how tourism affects, and as I start to have conversations with more and more people who aren't from Toronto, I'll gather the general opinion and assess that. But, obviously, it does have an effect, for sure. And like I said, if the man gets reelected, then that sets a very dangerous precedent, and it's really shooting ourselves in the head.
Well, I'll give you a quick story. I was recently on vacation, and I happened to be in the same room as a man and his wife who are actually from Canada. And someone else in the room made a comment to them, "Oh, you've come here to escape the crack smoking mayor. Is that why you're here?" So it's funny how we hear about something like this in the news, and then we start to associate a whole city or even a whole country with the actions of one human being. So I certainly hope that it doesn't sort of have that long-term, negative effect on how people view Canada.
Well, thank you very much, guys. So do I.
Yeah. Before we wrap things up here, Cale, I just have a couple of more questions for you. We've been talking about a lot of important issues today, but what do you feel are some of the actions people can take to really create change in their own lives? Perhaps they don't have the type of forum or reach that your voice does. Maybe they're just a so-called regular or average person. Not that I would use those terms, but those are kind of some of the terms that are used. What can they do to actually create change in their own lives?
I would just encourage anyone out there who is aware of some of the information that we're talking about to not be afraid to stand up, not be afraid to speak out, to be the change that you wish to see in the world. I think people just need to understand their own personal power. We need to realize that we're very powerful beings and that we're all capable of incredible things, and that we've just been kind of taught to believe that we're not, and conditioned to think that we're just little cogs in the machine who don't stand a chance of making a difference on a personal level. And in reality, that really couldn't be farther from the truth. It's actually the complete opposite. So I would just encourage everyone to find your voice. Don't be afraid to use whatever creative medium speaks most to you in order to get the message out there. And at the end of the day, I've got a huge amount of confidence that we're moving in the right direction. I really wouldn't be doing this if I didn't, but it is definitely going to require each and every one of us to be empathetic, to be courageous, to become leaders, and to choose love over fear.
Absolutely. Final question for you, Cale. What is the ultimate goal or the end goal for you in the hip-hop game? Where do you hope to take things eventually?
I mean, truth be told, it's less about me. It's less about me as a hip-hop artist or as a musician. It's really just all about getting the message out there and informing people who are open-minded, and inspiring other people to use their mediums, like I said, so that we can try to create some real change for the better, to try and make a better world. That's really what I'm motivated by, is just trying to help people. And, even as I get older, I'm not limited to hip-hop music. It's all about getting the message out there, trying to make a difference. So if one day it becomes more important for me to switch mediums, to get the information out there easier, if I need to switch and become a podcast host, or shoot documentary films, or do more public speaking, then that's what I'd be willing to do. Whatever it takes to spread the info.
Well, you're certainly welcome back on this podcast at any time, Cale. You've been a fantastic guest. So let me just say on behalf of all the listeners, thank you very much for your time this evening. Just want to give you the floor before I let you go to, promote anything you have going on at the moment, or just generally let people know where they can check out more of your music.
Okay. My main website is calesampson.com. You can feel free to add me on Twitter. And if you want to check out my new album, The Big Picture, it's available on iTunes. We also have a music video that we released for the lead single called Reach Up, which has been doing really well. It's very representative of my music and the album as a whole. So Reach Up on YouTube, and just look out for more videos, more shows, more coverage related to the Big Picture album in the future. My wife and I actually just shot a new video called The Truth Is, so that will be coming out soon. So keep an eye out for it.
Very good. Cale, thanks very much again for joining me today.
Thanks a lot, Guy.
In a world dominated by capitalism, the fact is war's not about nationalism or what television tells you to believe in. It ain't about security, it's not about freedom. It's about conquering resources, expanding an empire that's corporate, so industrial profits remain hoarded. A few rich elite people are rewarded. These individuals don't report to the government cause it's a revolving door where laws and policies are basically forged to benefit the rich while the poor are ignored. And to understand this is important. Out of war, a small group makes a fortune. Regardless of its inhumanity, it's actually wanted by industry, cause it's the most lucrative thing that can happen. And international bankers always cash in, forcing countries to borrow more and more money just to support their wars. The bottom line is more profit is made the longer that a war can be sustained. They're supposed to be long and go on, and believe it or not, they're not meant to be won. Look at history, you'll see events are staged within the government, then someone else is blamed. Public perception is manipulated to support agendas that before we were against. This is all done through the mass media, cause people believe what TV feeds to us. There's no real enemy in a war on terror, so what that means is it can go on forever.
Men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war.
I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
What if war and preparation for war is a racket? What if the American people woke up and understood that the official reasons for going to war are almost always based on lies and promoted by war propaganda in order to serve special interests?